Jon Jones has never been one to take wild chances as far as his career is concerned. For all of the recklessness that surrounds what we know of his personal life, the reigning light heavyweight champion's approach to the management of his fighting schedule has been measured, methodical, and above all else, risk-averse, to say the least. UFC 151 was originally scheduled to take place on the 1st of September 2012, featuring the headlining matchup between Jon Jones and the legendary former Pride champion Dan Henderson. Unfortunately, Henderson was forced out of the contest due to injury just under 2 weeks out, leaving Jon without an opponent. To those who lived through the weeks that led up to that event as a fan, you'll remember the disappointment that came as the dominant 205-pound king elected not to risk his status as champ by taking a short-notice matchup against Chael Sonnen, a fight that would have served as the fourth defense of his belt. In the end, UFC 151 was cancelled entirely, just 1 week out from the night itself. This move on the part of Jones stands as one of the many moments that the UFC president Dana White would rather forget as far as Jones is concerned, and as you would expect, the reaction of the fans to Jon and his team was one of pure anger. Now, I'm not here to condemn Jon for that decision, and if I'm being completely honest, this increasingly prevalent notion that pairs being a real fighter with taking risks with your career is a silly one at times. Yes, taking short-notice fights is commendable and downright admirable, but it's in no way a requirement to be considered great. In my eyes, the best should always fight the best when they're at their best, with the benefits of a full, focused training camp behind them and a game plan in place that will allow them to compete to their fullest. A few outliers aside, the product that we receive as a result of this will be as close to ideal as possible under these circumstances. We've seen the UFC begin to use the label of being a company man or a guy who'll fight anyone anytime as a means of manipulating the fighters, knowing full well that the fans will back them up. We've seen fighters passed up for title shots for this very reason, fighters who were unwilling to go in there at 70% or 80%. In reality, Jon didn't need to prove anything in 2012 by taking this type of risk, and he certainly doesn't need to do so now. But the risks involved in taking a short-notice fight differ greatly from the risk and the decision that lies before Jon at this time. A move to heavyweight would stand as a calculated risk, one removed from the decision that saw UFC 151 cancelled. And with a name like Francis Ngannou and the risk that fighting him would carry, I believe that Jon Jones has the opportunity to finally reach his potential. Yes, you heard me. Jones is one of the, if not the single greatest athlete to ever fight in mixed martial arts, and I do not believe for 1 second that he has reached his full potential in terms of his overall legacy. If we're speaking purely about the action inside the cage, I do not think it's a controversial stance to hold when I say that Jones's legacy is being hurt more and more every year by his measured approach to taking fights. I also think it's fair to say that his stock has never been lower. In the wake of Ngannou's astonishingly quick knockout of Jairzinho Rozenstruik at UFC 249, Jones engaged in a promising back and forth with the Cameroonian, and from the looks of things, both men appeared to verbally agree to a matchup. Now, I realise that in the time since, Jones, according to his tweets, brought this fight to the UFC, live tweeting all the while, before being told that the powers that be were not willing to make it worthwhile for him financially. A small part of me believes him, but a greater part of me thinks that Jones is simply playing the game, attaching his own name to the hottest brand in either of the two heaviest divisions. The man is a known Twitter troll after all. But for the purposes of this video, I don't care what his intentions were in making this entire saga as public as it was. What I'm here to argue is that Jones can truly break on through to the next level if he decides to take a calculated risk at this point in time. A risk that would involve a sufficient level of preparation, a full training camp, and a game plan designed specifically for the hardest hitter in the history of the sport. To say that Jon's rise has stagnated in recent years is an understatement. Personal issues aside, his highly technical and increasingly defensive style, though hugely impressive to watch in action, has left fans more disillusioned with the prospect of a Jon Jones fight than ever before. But it's not just his fighting style or his overall lack of finishes that's the problem. Outside of Daniel Cormier, when was the last time Jon Jones fought a big name? When was the last time Jones fought a fighter who the fans, and I mean the mainstream fans, genuinely saw as a threat to him going in? Like it or not, we are in show business here to a certain extent, and when the second half of your time spent at the top boasts Dominic Reyes, Thiago Santos, Anthony Smith, Ovin St. Preux, Glover Teixeira, and a fading Alexander Gustafsson as dance partners, is it really that hard to see why the fans are losing interest? Jones is a generational talent, and watching him fight live even to this day is a privilege. We should not make the mistake of forgetting that, even if he went down to the wire with Reyes and Santos. Greatness is all that Jon has ever known, and the opening half of his UFC career saw him collect the heads of some of the biggest names and greatest fighters in the sport's history. Now, Daniel Cormier aside, I think it's fair to say that he hasn't fought a big name since Chael Sonnen in 2013. That's not Jones's fault, don't get me wrong. The light heavyweight division is a shallow one at best. But if we're looking at this from a marketing perspective, and from the perspective of the masses who buy the pay-per-views, the incentives to tune in for a Jon Jones fight have been diminishing by the year. So while I understand that Jones is under no obligation to live up to anyone's expectations for him, I'm here to put forward a potential path to another level of greatness entirely. Love him or hate him, failed drug tests or not, Jones's resume is easily a top 3 of all-time entry. Losing now would do nothing to change that, because 12 years at the top flight is no easy feat by any means. But at this point, where the game is evolving at its natural pace and the competition at 205 pounds are slowly starting to close the gap, I believe that the time has come for the champion to make a decision. Jones, though undoubtedly great, would be criticised for 2 major shortcomings if he retired tomorrow, based purely on his actual fighting career. Number 1 being that he never moved to heavyweight, instead opting to rule over an increasingly stagnant division. And number 2 being that his superior technical mastery allowed him to, for the most part, nullify his opponents to such an extent that his bouts often lost their competitive edge because, simply put, at 205 pounds, he hasn't faced a fighter who can beat him. Yes, there were a few close decisions, but that's exactly what they were, close fights that could have gone either way. These are not criticisms of Jones that I would put a massive amount of weight on, but I'm speaking purely from the perspective of the fans overall. Fighting Francis Ngannou at this point in time would be, for lack of a better word, a badass move. A move that would see Jones receive respect from even the most fervent of his detractors. Jon Jones, the man who had never once been knocked down, the man who had barely ever been stunned, the man whose so-called worst performances came in razor-thin thrillers where he managed to get his hand raised. All of a sudden, that same man would be in very, very real danger. His technical mastery would be stacked up against a gulf in physicality. Those who love him would see their support re-energized to a level that it had perhaps never reached before, as the legend finally decides to buck the trend and take an almighty risk, the riskiest fight in the sport. Those who hate him will tune in to see if Ngannou can do what Ngannou does best. Win or lose, the public's interest in a Jon Jones fight reaches a level that it has not done in years, perhaps ever. Danger, very real danger, but with the victory of monumental proportions up for grabs. It also sets up a shot at the heavyweight title held by Stipe Miocic, lest we forget. But what happens if Cormier beats Stipe in their 3rd and final matchup, reclaiming the heavyweight title with a 2nd victory over the consensus greatest UFC heavyweight champion of all time? All of a sudden, the most compelling rivalry the sport has ever known has its 3rd chapter. This time with a version of DC that has finally realised his potential, fighting in his natural weight, and a Jon Jones who finally took the plunge. That is what the fight business is all about, folks, and I feel as though Jon Jones' career is in dire need of a touch of showbiz. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see more, be sure to hit subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.